Blueprints has destroyed my productivity this week. It's a dangerously addictive, repeating puzzle game about a young man who has inherited his great uncle's mansion full of rooms that rearrange every day. I'm not that far into the game, but already it's part of 3 trends in my gaming taste that I really appreciate, and I'm gonna quickly speak to them here. Number 1, the puzzle genre, talking broadly, might be my favorite kind of video game. Most video games have their roots traced back to competitions that are older than computers, competitive multiplayer experience showing similarities to organized sports and board games, and more modern shooter video games reminiscent of arcade shooting galleries. And particularly in the last 10 years, I found myself unimpressed with what technology by itself brings to those kind of experiences. Red Dead Redemption 2 was a really eye-opening game for me because despite being this marvel of technology, it was so repetitive that it all turned to mush in my head when I think about it in hindsight. Humanity's desire to solve puzzles, though, is really aided by increasing complexity of video games, and it's the kind of thing that really draws you into a world. It manifests in so many levels for Blueprints. Also, there's an intentional pun there. It is blueprints, like the son of a monarch, but it sounds like blueprints, the architectural mock-ups of a building, which is fitting because what you're doing in this puzzle game is deciding on the placement of rooms within this long grid system, and you're puzzling through what shape you want to build to avoid getting locked into dead ends and not being able to progress any further. But you're also learning things about what items would be in each room and how they might help you make it through the game. And then on top of that, there's rooms with overt puzzles in them you need to solve. And even further, there are ongoing puzzles to be uncovered in the environment that give you more incentive to pay close attention to absolutely everything. In all, even though this game is only a few gigabytes and has very unimposing graphics, the amount of different ways to engage with both the mechanics and the narrative are more diverse than games that take up half your hard drive where the primary point of interaction is hovering a cursor over the bad guys. The second thing I've been loving is games that make death canonical. One awkward bit of video games is dealing with fail states where the player dies, fails at something, or otherwise needs to start from an earlier point. When I first got really into gaming in the late 2000s, the primary way this was handled in the largest releases was a do-over. The story rewinds either to a point the game decided or that you decided to save at. This isn't inherently a bad thing, but it can be really awkward. I've been slowly working my way through Baldur's Gate 3, and a temptation I find hard to resist is rewinding the game every single time something went suboptimally for me. The colloquial term for this is save scumming, and while I'm against using it as a judgment against anyone, it's an impulse I find both hard to fight and destroys a lot of my personal immersion and enjoyment of a game. Blueprints handles this problem mechanically by being a roguelike, which, speaking in the broadest possible terms, involves the player embarking from the same start point until they reach a fail state, at which point they are returned again to the beginning. Each one of these cycles would be called a run. In Blueprints, they're called days. I'm pretty sure definitionally when the term roguelike is used, there's also an implication that each run has an element of randomness to it. The rooms rearrange each day in Blueprints. Hades had a ton of similar randomness, but the narrative impact of it doesn't really require that. Outer Wilds is a game with pretty much no random elements, but it works the general run nature into its story. It canonizes failure because the world resetting becomes a narrative point. In Outer Wilds, it's that the main character is stuck in a time loop. In Hades, you're the immortal son of the Lord of Death trying to escape the underworld, so every time you die, naturally, you return back home. In Blueprints, you've inherited a mansion from your great uncle with the explanation that it's magical and its rooms shift around every single day. The puzzle aspect of the game also makes diegetic sense because this is part of a challenge your great uncle has set for you, which also explains some other rules of the world, such as not being able to take any items from day to day or bring stuff in from the outside world. This is a way games can use the unique diegetic awkwardness of an interactive medium as a strength. And it's one of the cooler aspects of the proliferation of roguelikes, even if I'm a bit worried a large part of their popularity is just how addictive they are. And finally, I find myself appreciating games that subvert the need for me to look up guides online. Definitely something has been lost from the days where people would struggle through Myst for hours and hours stuck on the same puzzle before a Eureka moment. But the reality is that guides are so frequently used on the internet that it's almost inevitable. And Blueprints has, in my experience so far, found a way to make things progressively more clear through hints and semi-hidden tutorials. There are plenty of puzzles that are hard to grasp, but I found plenty of progressively more overt solutions that fall in spaces where the ones for puzzles I had already figured out were unobtrusive, and those for ones I was still struggling with were still satisfying because it had taken so long for me to discover them at the end of some other puzzle I'd worked hard to figure out. There's so much happening that there are enough opportunities to experience the friction from puzzle difficulty without making it feel like the only way you're going to see more parts of the game is to look something up outside. It's gotten to a place where I trust Blueprints to give me a rewarding way to progress in some direction, even if I'm stumped with one puzzle for a while. And this ability of a game to make guides obsolete is something I also really enjoyed in Avowed, a fantasy game that came out a few months ago. And this video is kind of a soft pivot back to video game content for the near future. I'm still committed to my weekly uploads of wildly varying quality, but it was unrealistic to assume I was going to stay fixated on one kind of media. I started Avowed and it brought up so many thoughts that I wanted to put into one big long project, but I'm intimidated by that and keep finding reasons to procrastinate. So I'm going to do the same thing I did with my movies top 10 a couple months ago and commit to a release schedule. And that's going to be the next 3 weeks will be the 3 parts of a series about Avowed, and specifically how I fear it is an early sign of game production changing to accommodate subscription models like Xbox Game Pass, much in the same way television production has warped around the popularity of Netflix. Look forward to the beginning of that next week.